There we go. So, first of all, I'm Kathy Dwyer. I work for Zobrio. Um, we are the provider of your MIP fund accounting software. I wanted to say thank you for everybody taking time out to spend an hour with us to go over some of the basics of the accounting system. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or speak right up and shout right out. I'm fine with that. We are currently, the screen that you folks are all looking at this is actually the FERCog server. This is my desktop off of the FERCog server, and what you'll see down here, let me just see if I can move that icon out. That's kind of right in the center of the screen now is that MIP fund accounting. That is the icon that we're going to click on and log into. Okay. This will take you up to a username, a password, and then based on your security settings, it will tell you or point you to a particular town. Okay. I am going to log in with my credentials. Okay. And as Bob just mentioned, the login for what we call our executive view users, which is probably the majority of folks on this phone call, is an executive view user is somebody that doesn't have full rights to the software. You know, you basically can inquire and you can report on the data, but you won't be doing any data inputting or maybe things like tax forms or running warrant reports and things of the like, but you're able to get information back from the system. And for the most part, you'll see that your user is the town name, and then Bob will provide you with the password if you don't have that. If it's the first time you're logging in, or if you are an individual that has access to more than one database, which think of a database as a different town, again, because I'm an administrator of the software, what you'll see is here in this drop list, you guys won't necessarily see all these, but you will see your town. And if you don't see your town, then certainly give a shout out. That means we don't have some security set up properly. So I'm going to just pick on the town of Ashfield, just simply because it's at the top of the list. We're not going to be making any changes. We're going to be looking at things like, how do I inquire out of the system? How do I pull a report from the system? So here we are, username, password, the database that we want to get into, and I'm going to tell it OK. And again, you're going to see more on my screen today than you'll see on your screen as an executive view user. But pretty much what we're going to do is start off by just some basic navigation of the screen. The panel that you see on the left-hand side of the screen, that vertical panel, it's really called a navigation panel. And based, again, on your security settings, you'll see different, they sort of call them piano keys with that plus sign. By hitting the plus sign, it expands out or more or less drills in, and you can see what's down underneath those choices. Okay. Across the top of the screen, you got some keywords like file and edit, and one we're going to look at shortly here is activities. So they also basically two different ways to access your software or functions within the software, whether you come off the navigator panel or the top down. Let's start by doing this if we could. Let's go up under activities. I tend to be probably a little old-fashioned. I tend to take the menu choices from a top-down approach. But what we're going to do is go into activity and display balances. Okay, and excuse me 1 minute. I'm just moving a banner out of my way. So activities, display balances, and then what you're going to see here is account balances and budget balances. The significant difference between these two jobs is the account balances basically will allow you to inquire on activity, like was an invoice entered, was a cash receipt posted, Whereas with the available budget balance, what that does is it introduces a budget amount, the actual activity, and an ending balance. So let's take a look. Let's start by going into account balances, and I'll probably spend a little bit more time here on this screen, simply because it's going to demonstrate some of the functionality that relates to the three type of queries we're going to look at and some of the reporting we're going to look at. So first of all, I'm going to take, let me just reset my screen a little bit. Let's say you come into this screen and it looks very much like this. Okay. At the top of the screen, you'll see date from, date to. Right now, my fields are highlighted in yellow, which means it requires a response. You have to give it a date range. Okay. So we'll work off of fiscal 22. Certainly, if you want to change that, you can either just click into a field and change it. Up and down arrow keys will move you up and down a value in each. The month, day, and year fields are all in kind of obviously work together, but they're also a bit independent when you're using those arrows. Or more popular, you can hit the calendar type icon and simply click on a value, and it will load in the full month, day, year. Okay. Now, what happens with these queries is this, if I was just to try to hit the display button, notice to the center right, there's a display button, but it's grayed out. What the program's basically saying is you gave me a date range, but you're not telling me what you want to query on. And the way you select fields to query on is you basically can do one of two things. For instance, here on the left-hand side, if I highlighted fund, I could single click it and then hit the, looks like the greater than sign to move it to the right. If I want to deselect it, I select it in the right-hand box and move it back to the left. You can also double-click a field to select it. We'll double-click it to deselect it. But what happens here is, what are these available filters on the left? Well, when you see fund, department, object, year, project, sub, those are the 6 individual, what they call segments, that make up your general ledger account. So if you were going to look at your general fund in a particular department, and you just wanted a departmental report, you might just filter on those 2 segments. So, for instance, here, let me double-click fund, okay? The compares to on the right side of the screen, if I click into that field, you'll see that there's a bunch of different, if you will, qualifiers. It defaults to the equal sign, and I'll come back to those in just a minute. But what we're basically saying is I want an inquiry where the fund number equals 001, okay? And again, what happens is I can click into that white area. It will give me the drop arrow, and you'll get a full list, so that if you're not completely versed, you know, who's going to memorize all these numbers. But what it does is it will give you the number along with the description, and you'll be able to basically select what you're looking for. Okay. Once I make that first selection, now that display button on the right has focus. Right now, this type of query would be maybe somewhat, don't want to say useless, but if you're looking for the entire fund, there you go. You know, you could hit the display button. But if I wanted to say, well, you know what, I'm only maybe interested in my own department, okay? And the reason this is coming in with a default value of 210, which is the police department, it basically remembers the last time I ran a query and put something in there, okay? But I can certainly change that. If I wanted fire, I could change it to fire. Now, what happens at this point is that just by selecting those 2 segments, if you will, if I hit the display button, okay, what's going to happen now is this is just a departmental inquiry. Okay, it's not drilling down to a specific GL called an object code. It's the entire department. And what you'll see when you're drilling into expenses and revenue, also in conjunction with the date range, this one, because it's running the full fiscal year, there's no beginning balance at the start of the year. And again, keep in mind, this doesn't include the budget, it's just the actual activity. So when I look at those blue stripes and read across horizontally, don't worry too much about the fact that the 7-1 has a posted amount of 0. Um, Really, your activity is falling in under that second line, the 67, 348.74, and that's a nice number. But again, you look at it and you say, well, that's nice, but somewhat useless. But keep in mind, on the left-hand side of the screen, when you see plus signs on a horizontal line, you can go ahead and hit that plus sign. And what it does is it starts drilling in and showing you the details behind, in this case, the 67, 348.74. Now, the way you read this detail is this, okay? The darker blue lines, when it says effective date, that's when it literally hit the general ledger. Your invoice could have been dated, let's say, May 1st, but it hit your 7/5/2021 effective date, meaning it was posted against your fiscal 22 budget. Other things beyond the date that are pretty handy here is transaction type. Okay, API, what's that? Well, MIP uses a lot of 2- and 3-character values to kind of distinguish a type of transaction. API stands for Accounts Payable Invoice. Okay? If I go out to the right side of my screen and use the scroll bar and come down, what I'm just curious about to see if there's anything other than APIs. Okay? So at this point for that fiscal year, pretty much what you're seeing there is just invoices have been posted against this account. And when you say, well, what account exactly are you referring to? Well, all I see right now is a fund in the department. Again, keep in mind there's a plus sign next to the darker blue line. I can click plus, and it's going to drill into that transaction. Okay. Now, what you're going to see there with that transaction basically is now you can see that this was not only posted against Fund 1, Department 220, but you can see your object code is 5400 with a year 0 and a project of 635. So anytime you see a plus sign, the drill in will give you more details. So if you're not seeing enough details at this level, then you might want to just keep drilling in to find more information. The column that says document number, in this case, because the transaction type is API or accounts payable invoice, the document number is the invoice number. A couple fields over, the ID obviously is the vendor. Okay? And then essentially what happens is a session ID is kind of, think of it as the batch that somebody keyed the transactions in on, but it's also doubles as the warrant number. So between the session ID and jumping over to the last column, document description, basically you're saying that that's the warrant that it was paid out of. Okay. And in between that document date, in between those two columns, the document date is intended to be the invoice date. Now, what I can do with this information, if I see enough here, I can hit the print button, top center. It will ask me if I want summary or detail. Okay, let me show you detail and say OK. It's going to typical kind of barber pole type information, but what it will do is more or less do a screen print. Obviously, it brings it up on the screen before it fires it out to the printer. But once you see it here on the screen, what you can do is notice the row of icons at the very top of the screen. Exit means just, yep, I got it. I looked at it. I'm happy with it. Get me out. Okay. If there's multiple pages, you've got the blue arrow. A single arrow takes you one page at a time. A double arrow takes you to the last page. And the tooltips are pretty good. Tooltip is when you hover the cursor over an icon and it tells you what that icon will do. But pretty much, if you're using this as a true inquiry and you're just looking, there's your paging. And if I went to the end, now notice the blue arrows pointing to the left now have focus because now we've gone from one page, forward and back. you want to print that, just click on the printer icon. If for any reason you want to export it, maybe to an Excel spreadsheet, that's that XL icon. If you want to send it to a PDF file, that would be, guess what, the PDF icon. Okay. There's also an email icon. If you want to, basically what it would do is open up an email template and attach this report to it, or inquiry, and you get to specify who you'd like to email that to, even if you wanted to email it to yourself. So let's say we're good with that. We can say exit. I can come in here and I can roll things back up. I might say that's nice, but I want to look specifically maybe at account 5400. So I bring in the object 5400. This time when I hit display, what used to be 67,000 on the right side of the screen is now down to 21,000, because apparently there's more than one expense line against this particular fund 1220. So really the point is the more segments that you select, again moving left to right, the more detailed your information will be on this report. Alrighty, so let me do this again. Let's go ahead and hit close on the lower right. And where we just were again was under activities, display balances, and then the account balances, which again, you didn't see any budget numbers there. You just simply saw actual activity. If we wanted to introduce some budget numbers, we would still be here under display balances, but go to available budget balances. And the screen is very similar in the sense that you have a date range at the top, okay, and it can be anything you want it to be. It can be a month, a day, it can cross over fiscal years. But the concept, again, is by moving fields left to right, you're selecting them. This has a memory the last time we ran this. And if I go ahead and hit display at this point, okay, notice what's different here is this top line shows us all the segments we selected. We have a column for total budget, total column for actual for to date through this date range, and then the available balance. And the same principles apply in that anytime you see that plus sign, you can drill into it. Okay. And what this one shows you a little bit different is those first two columns, budget or BD, that's the short code to indicate a budget. So not only do you have APIs, which are the invoices, but you have BD or the budget. So what was budgeted, what was expense to date. Same print options. Okay. Now, one thing I didn't talk about in that previous inquiry is this, is by default, and let me select, I'm going to click and drag and highlight all those entries, fund, department, and object, and I'm going to hit the arrow and send them back. If I wanted to inquire on, say, a fund, and again, I'll double click it, the compares to in the upper right there. Even though the default is an equal sign, you can do things like less than, not equal to, greater than, between. Okay, let me demonstrate the between. What ends up happening with the between is now the criteria 1 and the criteria 2 both need a response, because obviously we need a beginning parameter and an ending parameter. So you can do things like that if you have a range that you're looking for. On the other hand, if let's say you wanted a list and it's not necessarily a consecutive list, you could do something like this. You could go 001, comma, and then 217, comma, and I'm just sort of making up those numbers. But what you simply do is in your list, if you're doing the in comparative, if you will, your list is numbers separated with a comma. So depending on the scenario, and let me hit clear there, depending on the scenario that you're looking for, yep, it defaults to equals, but you have different operands in here that it's not as rigid as you can only get one value. There's different ways to use these qualifiers. Okay, good. I have a question here that's asking if I could show a query that would be for all accounts that are less than zero, in other words, in a deficit. Let me jot that down, and when we get to the reports, I'm going to show you how to do that. Because what happens here with the query is you'll notice there's not a filter that talks about amounts. You're just filtering basically on your segments that make up a GL account. But we'll see if we can get that information from a report. And one of the things that makes the report unique is you can always run a report to the screen. You don't have to necessarily physically print it. And if it's up on the screen, then it more or less becomes a query, if you will. So we'll come back to that shortly. I'm going to go ahead and close here. Okay. And I'm going to just show you a third query that might be of interest. Okay, it's back up under activities. We were under display balances, and that shows you basically queries by your GL numbers. If you wanted to query by vendor, come on down to activities, accounts payable, and display vendor balances. Now, some of the principles here are very similar. What you want to do is start with a vendor ID. And let me do just a quick aside here. Okay, is fields, and that's probably a good message that you see right there, is vendor ID is required, and certainly it's kind of speaks for itself in this instance. But one of the things that you can look at when you're in your system is this, is that the word options at the top of the screen. If you go there and come down to customize workstation settings, okay, if you go to the colors tab, okay, and you make sure that you've got a check mark in that highlight required fields box, top one on the left, and then you can hit that color box and select a color here. And my recommendation is stay with the lighter shades, because it's if you select black, you're not going to see black print on a black background. But what that will do for you and there it goes with my black color, just what I said not to do, Kathy. Let's go select the yellow and say okay. What that will do is it's a simple thing, but what it does is any fields that require a response, it's going to light up with that background color of your choice. Now, when you get to the vendor ID, I'm going to just hit the drop arrow to show you something here. When we first implemented the MIP fund accounting for the different towns, we went from a numeric vendor number to more of an alphanumeric, and mostly alpha, if you will. And instead of having to kind of search around for a vendor number, it's basically the ID is a takeoff from the vendor name. So it's the first few characters there. Okay. So for instance, here, if I started typing in my classic staples, okay, the more characters I type, the more refined my list will be. I might say, oh, is that really the right one? I can put in those many characters and hit the drop arrow, and I can look and say, oh, yeah, it's probably the credit plan. It's probably that one. So basically, by putting in, if you leave that field blank and you hit the drop arrow, it's going to, with the exception of where I just was, it's going to start you back at the top of the list. If you prefer, instead of having to scroll down and look for all the vendor, you can always put in a character, and it will take you to that beginning point in the alphabet, and then hit the down arrow to make it a little quicker to find a vendor. So here, let me come in here and select police supply. again, just I'm taking a swag at if I pick a vendor that's had activity. Um, I'm going to jump down to the date range. Okay, and let me leave the date range at, you know what? Let me back it up. Let me back it up and go for the last 2 fiscal years. Okay, and then above the date range, there's this lookup from, and it says CHK, and what's that? Well, if you hit that drop arrow, this will show you what the responses, possible responses are. And not only does it give you the code, it gives you a little description. And depending on what you're looking for, if you wanted to see like invoices and checks and any revenue that might be redeposited back to a vendor or anything like that, you would go with all activity. If you were looking for invoices that are entered but into the system but haven't been paid, that would be the O or Open API or AP invoice. If you were looking for just invoices or credit memos, credits, or if you're just looking for checks, you might just put in CHK. Let me go with all activity, and it just, there's not really a right or wrong answer here. The all activity is basically going to make sure nothing gets filtered out. But if you were specifically looking for a check number, you might just select the option check. But it's kind of the same concept. You've put in your vendor. You're going to look for all activity for the date range that's presented there. And then I'm going to hit the display button. Okay, don't let the system fool you that, oh, there's no activity. Make sure you hit that display button, because that's when it goes out and it looks for, based on your responses, then it goes out and looks for some data that matches your criteria. And similar to our previous inquiries, you've got these lines, and it's nice to say, okay, we got a document number, we got a document date, we got a description and an amount. Well, it's a little thin on detail, but if we hit the plus sign, it's going to drill into it. Okay? And what you're going to see here, in particular with the vendors, that makes it helpful is, notice those two darker blue lines. One's API, one's APS. What that basically says is my API is an invoice. The APS it's a system printed check. So it's an accounts payable system printed check. And the reason I point that out is because now as you read across and you look at the document number on the API or invoice record, the document number is the invoice number. The APS, which again is a system printed check, the number that you see there is a check number. Okay? And it shows you, again, additional detail. Keep drilling in. You might look at that and say, that's nice, but what was that invoice posted against? Which account? What specific expense account? Just go ahead and hit the plus sign on the record, and it will just keep drilling in. And now that you can see basically that invoice number 90969 for $1,696 was posted against Fund 1, Department 210, Object 5400, 0640. So you can get, with these three queries that we've sort of looked at here, you can look at things from a GL perspective or from a vendor perspective. There is likewise print buttons here if you want to print out that screen. But there, and those are quick ways to look for information. Okay, it's really when you're looking for something very specific that these three queries can come in handy. Let me just check the chat. Just by fiscal year. Question here is how far back does the data go in the system? And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and I'll double check this, when we converted over from an accounting system called Fundware into this MIP fund accounting, we didn't bring in any vendor history. I believe there's at least 3 years there. but I'll do a double check to make sure I'm correct on that. But I'm pretty sure it's at least 3 years that we've been up and running on MIP fund accounting. Okay. And the way you can get that information is almost, you can almost even do it something like this. If I backed up the date range to 2018 and I said display, I've basically picked a vendor that only has current year activity. But if you have a vendor, let's do the one you mentioned. One of the things, too, that you can do here with these columns is, right now it looks to me like it's probably sorting by document number. If I double-click the column type that says document date, it's going to put it in a sort order. Like double-click it once, and you notice the A to Z at the end of the column title. So it's sorting on that column, ascending to descending. If I click it again, it will do a descending sort, Z to A. But this kind of gives us an idea. Let's probably get started on this system of July of calendar 2018. So what would that be? Fiscal 19, fiscal 20, fiscal 21. So we're going into our 4th year on this system, I believe. And you can get that information. The one thing that's happening here with this query is it is showing you everything that was paid to the vendor, not specifically from a particular department. Okay, that filtering is not available here. Alrighty, let's close out of here and talk a little bit about the reporting in the system. Okay. I'm going to pick on one category of report or one specific report to demonstrate the functionalities. But pretty much what happens is up at the top there where it says reports, if I click on that, what you're going to see is this, instead of basically coming up with a big phone book of reports, report names, the system is categorizing the types of reports. Within each type, for instance, here if I pick lists, out of the way, under lists we can get a chart of accounts. We can get these other things called distribution codes. And while I'm at it, let me just say this to you, is if you want to run a list for your particular town and you say chart of accounts, and let's go in there. When I pick that category, the report name, it's in yellow. It says, hey, I need something. Okay. If I hit the drop arrow, what I'm going to do is see some reports that have been either come standard with the software or other users that have been in your town software have created. Okay. And what we basically do is select one of those reports and run it. The difference, how do you know which ones were templates that automatically came with the software versus a report that a user has created? Well, the report templates are the ones with those pointed brackets in front and behind the report name. And they're fine to run. If I go ahead and select one, and what I'm going to do is to get that report to run, I like to hit that monitor icon at the top. Okay. You could also hit the page preview or the preview to the right of that, or you could hit the printer icon. I tend to start, not that my way is the only way, but I tend to hit the monitor because what that will do is bring the report up on the screen. Okay, it's in a pretty good font so I can see it, and I can page through the data. Okay. If you see, in terms of chart of accounts, this sometimes gets a little tricky in the system, but the chart, what the system's calling a chart of accounts is basically a list of your segments. So at the header of the report where it says department -2, that means the department is the second segment in your string of numbers, and here's a list of all your departments. If I page forward, notice now my header goes from department to fund, and that's our first segment, and there's a list of all the different funds in the system. And I could keep going forward. Objects, which as you can see here, and it probably makes more sense if we come down here. Here's our revenue and some expense codes. But that is, and let's do this. I'm going to hit that exit button on the left there to close out. That basically, when we're in here saying run me a list and we select chart of accounts category, it's showing you the segments. I'm going to go ahead and hit close on the lower right. Okay? And I'm going to come back to reports and lists. And I do want to show you this one called account code combinations. Combination, as the name implies, is basically, I'll just grab one that's there and just bring it up onto the screen. Okay. What the account code combinations do is they basically string together not just a list of funds or a list of departments. What you'll see here in this report is it's basically doing a page break by what looks like the department moderator 114, and then it shows you the string, the rest of the full GL string. Okay. If I page forward, it's now going to go to the select board, keep going, town administrator. So if you're wondering what your accounts look like, the full string, you certainly can come in here under reports, lists, and it's the account code combination report. But let's do this. I'm going to exit out of here for a second, and then I'm going to close on the lower right. And again, starting back at the top at reports, they are broken down into categories. Again, simply because there can be a wealth of these reports in the system, and rather than just kind of do a splat, here's a big list, it tries to categorize them. And depending on what you're looking for, whether it's detail or summary, you'll select a particular category. And I'll tell you what's kind of a more popular report is under reports in this general ledger analysis. If you come down to the second one that says an expanded general ledger, kind of get the same response like you did with lists, and then it takes you to a report name. If you hit the drop arrow, again, you'll see reports that are, again, the pointed bracket ones here came with the system, or you can see other reports that were created by previous and current users in the system. Okay. If you do happen to select a report, and notice to the right-hand side in this list, if it's secured by, and there's a name there, it means you can run it, but it's not going to let you change it. So, for instance, here, let's see. Let me see if I can get something that just makes sense to what we're doing here. Let me just grab that one. If I came in here, and we'll talk more about these filters here in just a minute. Let's say I wanted to take away that object code. Okay. What ends up happening is there's going to be instances when you go to run this, and the program's going to say, you got to give me a new name before you can run it. And what I just did, it didn't force that. But if you do select an existing report in the menu, and you make a change to it, and it says save it under a new name, just give it a name. Just enough to make the program run and give you the report information, and then it will be up to you when you go to exit whether you want to save that or not. You can always pick a report, and let me do a better job of demonstrating that. Let me undo that. We'll talk about that in a second. If I come in here and I pick, let's go with the expanded general ledger this year, okay? And again, this is a template, a system template, because it's within the brackets. And if I came in here and I said, you know what, I want to change this date range, okay? Notice what happens is, here's an example of what I was trying to say, is By making a change to the date range, notice that my report name went away. It's blank. And if I go to try to display that on the screen, the program says, wait a minute, you got to give me your report name. And if you think it's something that you're going to keep and you'll want to run now and later, give it a reasonable name, something that you can understand by later. Okay. If it's something that maybe you just want to run once and you're not going to save it, just give it anything, because what will happen is just by virtue of having a name there, you can display that report to the screen. Okay? And I'm going to hit cancel because there's so many records there. It will take a second. But what ends up happening is it will display on the screen, and when you go to close out, you can either say, save it, or you can say close, and it will prompt you, do you want to save it? And you can either say yes or no. So if it's just something temporary that you don't want to save, obviously you would respond accordingly. No, don't save that report. Okay. Let's go through some of the concepts of reporting. Okay. I'm going to hit the undo button on the lower right. Okay. That basically undoes anything I've done since the last save. Okay. So if I go back to my drop arrow and I search down, I'm not going to see my temp report because I didn't save it. But let's do this. Let's grab the expanded general ledger this year. Again, what happens here is you're going to see a series of tabs across the top of the screen, okay, that control not only the amount of data that you're going to see on your report, but how that data is presented on the printed page. Okay. You can put the header or the name of the report in the header or the footer, okay, or not at all. Okay. You can basically, and in this case, I made a change, so it's going to basically say, give me something. So I'm going to just put my name in there. Okay. This particular report is asking you what date range you want to report on. Okay. Typically, when you have a date range, it's like from two dates. So why do we see 4 here? What's going on? Well, this report allows you to do cross-fiscal year reporting. So that comes in handy, in particular, if you're working on grants that may span multiple years or cross between fiscal years. Okay. And typically what you do here is the first date that you see on the upper left is a date when your accounting books will last closed. I'm going to cheat a second and just come up here and do something here. Okay, that tells me that fiscal 21 is closed. So basically what you do is you say, okay, we're not crossing between fiscal years at this point. I want to basically start with 7/1/21. Okay, both those dates will be equal. Okay. If I did change that upper date to fiscal 20, notice the statement that comes into play on the lower left where it says, hey, you're crossing between fiscal years, so we're going to do a simulated close. We're not going to change the accounting books, but the system's going to basically show us data as it rolls from year to year. Once you establish those dates on the left side of the screen, and not all reports will have 4 dates, just some of them do. But what happens is you're establishing, again, the start of your fiscal year on the left, and then on the right, you can more or less basically say something like this. Maybe you just want to see what happened in August. Okay, it doesn't necessarily have to be a repeat of those same dates. At this point, you can select a time period within the selected fiscal year. But once you get beyond the dates, what happens here is on the Content tab, okay, we got these 4 quadrants on the screen. Okay, the upper 2 very much like the query, moving values left to right selects them, right to left deselects them, and the upper 2 boxes basically decide where you want to see a page break. and you can do this too. I was showing you one at a time, but I can click and drag and highlight two and hit the arrow. Okay. And what this is telling me at this point is I'm going to run a report that every time the fund department code combination changes, it's going to do a page break. Reading across, if I wanted to see a total by fund and perhaps a total by department, it's just as simple as putting check marks in those boxes so that the system can present us with some totals. You don't necessarily have to have a page break, but if the presentation of the data lends itself to page breaks, by all means, go right ahead and do that. The lower two boxes, if you will, same concept, left to right selects, right to back to left deselects. These are the columns that you'll see on your report. Okay? So object code, object title, document number. These are all will be different columns on the report. So let's just take a look at that. And again, notice object code, object title. We got debits and credits down the bottom. Okay. If I display that up to the screen, it's basically going to go out and look for the information we're asking for, whether it's filtered or not, and it presents the data. Okay, so notice that the top header of the report it tells you basically who you are and what report you're running. The page break is on fund and department and the date range that was selected. The columns, some of them were object code, object title, the debits and credits way out in the end, and then what they call the transaction source. So the way this happens is, again, I'm going to hit the exit in the upper left. Okay. I might look at this and say, yeah, that's okay, but what's this sort of transaction source hanging down the bottom? I'd rather see that resequenced in a different column. Well, I can highlight that column, and notice there's arrows on the left, the right-hand side of the screen, up and down arrows. If I hit the up arrow, notice what's happening to my transaction source. It's reseating itself to a different spot on the report. And that's fine to do. There's nothing wrong with that. It really depends on what you want that report to look like. Beyond the column selections, and be a little bit careful about the columns that you select, because you are limited to the size of a piece of paper. You know, you can print it portrait at 8.5 by 11, or you can print landscape 11 by 8.5. But you know, you can't get it beyond that. If you go beyond the margins, if you will, the data will wrap to a second page and be pretty hard to read. But what you'll see is if you go right smack into the middle of the screen and follow your eyes over to the left where it says report body, total width equals 9.70, okay, that's always a good barometer to say, okay, how much data, you know, when I look at my columns that I've selected, will they fit on the page? So you want to keep an eye on that. Also keep in mind while we're talking about the size of a column, here with the object code on the lower right quadrant, notice as you read across there's a column called width. Okay? The 0.75 means in inches. I can click in that and say, you know, reduce the size of that column. Okay? I could even come over a few fields to the right of that where there's a box that says wrap, and I could put a check mark into that field. Okay, not so much on number fields, to be honest, do I find I'm wrapping, but I might do that on like a transaction description. Okay, so if the space on my report is limited, I might cut down the width of the column, but tell it to auto wrap. And what that will do is it won't truncate or lose data off the report, but it will wrap it to a second line. But pretty much what's happening here in this grid area on the lower right is the data, not only are you selecting the columns, but sorting. You can sort ascending, descending, or no sort at all. where it has focus in the show totals. A check mark simply says, give me a total at that level, or no check mark means no total necessary. You can control the width of the column. Repeats. Do you want to see, like if perhaps you had 10 transactions on the report for object code 5400, do you want that 5400 to display on all 10 lines, or do you want it just on the first line, 5400, and then don't show me that code again until it increments or changes? The wrap that we spoke about, and then even if you want to change column headings, you can do that on the extreme right-hand side of the screen. Okay. Now, one thing just to keep in mind, you don't necessarily have to do this every time you need a report. If you've developed a report that you like and you want to save it under a certain name, it's cataloged, and you can pull it up the next time, so you're not having to do this redesign over and over again. Okay, it's just initially, if you don't find a report in the system that you like and you want to try give it a whirl, go right ahead, and don't be afraid to basically say, let me take a swag at it, and then hit your display to the screen. If it doesn't look the way you want it to look and it's a tad bit ugly, just come right back and change things. Maybe you add another column. Maybe you take a column away, resequence it, resort it. You can do that. There's no rules that restrict you as far as when you're developing a report, how many times it takes to get it exactly the way you want to see it. Now, speeding along, let me just tell you one more thing. Actually, I'm going to tell you a couple of things about this. On the filter tab of this report, upper left, right now, without a filter, this basically would look at the entire accounting system and give me a report on the whole system. But keep in mind, again, if I wanted to just report on maybe my fund, maybe the general fund, same concept. I'm selecting the fund. I want just Fund 1. Okay? And if I go ahead and display that up to the screen, what will happen here in just a moment is remember, we're doing a page break by fund and department. So what you're going to see is your department code, fund, one in basically blank. Okay. And this is probably not the best example because we got a bunch of these blanks here going on with the department code. But let me scoot out to the end and back up that way. Notice here the Fund 1, Department 916. And I'm going backwards now, 914. So this is a way that you're still going to have the same foundation of the report, but you can control how much data or which fund and department in this example that you're reporting on. I might come in here and say, well, you know what, that's nice, the general fund, but give me specifically, I don't know, let's pick on fire this time, 220. And again, if you don't have those numbers memorized, just, again, click the drop arrow in the field and you'll see a number and a definition. This time when I display it to the screen, what you're going to see is, again, the same foundation, the same layout of the report, but and as the header indicates, Fund 1, 220, okay, we're getting a total for account 5100, a total for account 5400, and if I was to skip all the way down to the bottom, and let's back up a page, we're getting basically there a departmental total, and again, departmental total, because we're asking, or fund total, I should say, because we're just asking for one combination. But that information, again, is you're fine to do that. You're fine to come in here and play with these. They're not going to impact anything. If I hit exit and I say close, if I've made changes to a report and it hasn't been saved, we get this prompt. Okay, if we save it, okay, system closes out, and let me do that one more time. Reports, general ledger analysis. It was under the expanded general ledger. If I hit drop down, scroll down, there's that report I just created, and you'll always have a date and time stamp on it too, as far as who's doing what. Okay, but let me tell you just one final thing, because I know we're running out of time a bit here. Is the layout tab is of a report is pretty handy. Okay, not so much that you're changing the font and the font size on the upper side of the screen, but on the lower right portion of the screen where it says page setup. When you click on that, what this will do is this is where you can change a report from a portrait to a landscape layout, and again, feel free to reduce the margins. They come in at a half-inch margin, all on top, bottom, left, and right. I've been known to reduce these right down to a quarter of an inch, and it just gives you more real estate on the report to fit your data. But this, again, the reformatting of the report, if you feel like, that's more than I want to get involved in, just feel free to come into the reports, browse around to a category, even if you stay with the general ledger analysis, come on in, select one. I would say, some of these are very specific. It looks like something people were looking to do, but you could always get a generic report, control it through your date range, control it through your filters, and I think basically that's another way of getting information back from the system without having to get involved in report designing. So, guys, I've had a few questions here that I haven't answered. Okay, not that I'm ignoring you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to answer those in an email to Bob and ask him if he would share those out to you guys. They are basically looking for a combination of vendor and GL accounts, and maybe that's one, and then the other one was help me find accounts in a zero deficit. So let me give those instructions in an email off to Bob. He'll share them with you, and because of course the answer is yes. It's all out there. It just takes a bit to get to that. We did kind of limit ourselves to an hour today, but I do want to get those questions answered. So there it is. That's what we had for today. Again, give it a whirl. Get in the system. See if you have any luck. If it's frustrating you, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to help you out, even if it means design a report and save it in the catalog for you. But hopefully you guys picked up some tips today. And until next time, I appreciate you guys taking the time.